Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. David Swenson is still on break. I'm sitting today, across the country that is, with my dear friend Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, our 10 Things series, and today it's 10 things about the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Welcome, Lindsay.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I suspect we will have lots to say.
Lots to say, and we're moving a little bit beyond the founding generation here. Wilson was president from 1912 to 1920. A big question. You know, most of us grew up through our middle school and high school learning that Wilson was the 14 points and the failure of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations and so on. Is that the most important thing we need to know about Woodrow Wilson?
You're starting with all guns a-blazing. I think the ideas contained in the 14 points are certainly Wilson's biggest impact. Now, I sometimes question that, though, because he didn't actually succeed in getting them passed and didn't succeed in getting the nation to adhere to them, and it took Franklin Roosevelt and the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt to actually make that happen. But certainly I think the concepts, the ideas, the ideology that he presented are perhaps his most lingering legacy.
You know, there are two basic approaches to foreign policy. There are the idealists, and then there are the pragmatists. So Hamilton is the pragmatist, and he's the progenitor of that. George Washington was a pragmatist, too, I would say. And then there's the Jefferson-Wilson-Carter school, towering idealists who believe that we can all just get along in the world and that maybe we can build a world of peace and cooperation and so on. And Wilson usually is pretty well drubbed by the hard-headed realpolitik types. What happened? What happened to the 14 points in the League of Nations? You would think that after the cataclysm of World War I, the Great War in which tens of millions died, that the American people would have cautiously believed that a League of Nations was a good idea. So what went wrong?
I'm going to start by saying something kind about Jefferson, so you may want to be sitting down so as to not fall over in shock. So I do think that Jefferson was an idealist, but once he got into office, he was quite pragmatic and was willing to take opportunities that came his way, especially the Louisiana Purchase. And as I think we've discussed on previous episodes, set aside his constitutional scruples to make it happen. So he wasn't above trying to do what was expedient in order to necessarily do what was right. And I think that's where Wilson got into trouble. So at the end of World War I, a lot of Americans looked around and they said, we just lost all of these people, and for what? I think it's helpful to draw a contrast to World War II, where first there was unconditional surrender by the German forces. So Americans and their allies were able to dictate terms on such a way that it made something like the United Nations and a more comprehensive, long-lasting peace possible. That was not necessarily the case at the end of World War I because it wasn't an unconditional surrender. Second, while the German Empire was sort of the aggressor in World War I, it didn't have the same sort of defeat the evilness of the Nazi regime that happened in World War II. So it was harder to make the case for continued U.S. involvement to try and prevent that sort of reemergence of an evil empire from coming back. And I think that the United States was certainly, by the end of World War I, a global power, but it was not in the unparalleled position that it was at the end of World War II, where it was really the last one standing and had the ability to craft what the post-war would look like. And so as a result, Wilson had this grandiose idea that it would be the war to end all wars, and here is this plan for the League of Nations to ensure that nations speak with one another, and if you can talk through these problems, then you're not going to have these types of war. And yet, a couple of things happened that made it impossible for him to implement that concept. First, he was very sick in Europe, so he wasn't able to do the type of politicking with his allies that were essential to get the sort of European support that were necessary. He then came home, and while he was doing his tour around the country to build support, he had the series of strokes that left him bedridden and unable to continue to really do his job in any way, shape, or form. And lastly, whereas previously in his administration he had done such a good job of cultivating congressional support before introducing a measure to ensure the passage of really essential legislation, he didn't do that this time. And I don't know if he just thought that he could force it through with the power of his will or whatever it was, but Congress had no interest in this document, and so therefore there was no domestic support for this international regime.
My own reading of Wilson is that he had a kind of messiah complex, that he thought of himself as the savior of the world. We must fight this war to make the world safe for democracy. When it ends, we will present these highly idealistic plans for arbitration and for disarmament and so on. And I think that someone like Hamilton or Theodore Roosevelt, who was a Hamiltonian, would say that's no reflection of the real world, and one person, no matter how gifted, is not going to be able to persuade the world to change the habits of millennia. The idea that had a messiah complex and also was exceedingly stubborn can be seen as maybe having helped to lead to his strokes, that he had in a sense, he had a breakdown. And it wasn't purely just his physical health. He was promoting an idea that was so dear to his heart that he couldn't live without it. And he couldn't believe that people like Henry Cabot Lodge and others were holding it up, and not always for noble reasons either. And I think that incredible disappointment of maybe being the most far-seeing American of his time, but being compromised by his own hubris, I think that had just a profound effect. And as you know, Warren Harding was overwhelmingly elected in 1920 as almost a repudiation of all of that idealism.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, certainly there were underlying health conditions, and he had some heart issues for a while, really high blood pressure, and their knowledge of medicine and how to prevent some of these things was not what it was today. And he took on a overly rigorous form of domestic campaign to, as you said, try and push this through because it was so important. But he was a deeply religious man. He was a deeply spiritual man. He was a Presbyterian, and he believed that sort of God was guiding his actions. And so I think you're right that he had this driven complex and quite an ego. He was not necessarily a humble man. And it's certainly that sort of intense stress did not help.
I'm talking to Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, 10 Things About Woodrow Wilson. You said, we talked at the beginning about the 14 points in the League of Nations, but as I think about Wilson, I'm just bewildered, Lindsay, that it would be one thing for President Wilson not to have advanced civil rights during his 2 terms as president, but to have actually deliberately set them back and to segregated the federal bureaucracy and kind of involved an apartheidist concept of our government with an unmistakably condescending attitude towards the capacities of African Americans. I just find that appalling. It's one thing if he said, that's not my issue, somebody else will have to handle all of that. But he didn't. He actually worked hard to set back the possibilities of racial integration.
He did. And I think one of the aspects of Wilson that can help not explain, because that sounds like justify, but sort of elucidate where this came from is, even though we often think of him as the president of Princeton or the governor of New Jersey, he was a Southerner. He was born and raised in Virginia. He was born in 1856. His earliest memories were of Confederate soldiers returning from the war and Union soldiers coming in and occupying Georgia, and was raised by a family that was deeply sympathetic to the Southern cause and taught him that the Southern cause was right and just, and that it wasn't necessarily about slavery, but protecting a way of life. And he was sympathetic to the racial code and the racial hierarchy that developed after the war as well, and believed that the best way to reduce tension between the races was to keep them entirely separate. Now, of course, we find these views abhorrent, but he brought them from his birthplace all the way up through his next several positions and into the presidency. And as you said, really set back the cause of civil rights and set back the progress that Black Americans had made in the federal government for quite some time in a way that was extremely detrimental, because the federal government had been a place where a lot of Black Americans could get decent middle-class jobs at post offices, in the various bureaucracies, and by denying those opportunities, he really set back thousands of families for generations.
Set back this country. Theodore Roosevelt, his predecessor once removed, gets mixed grades on his own racial enlightenment, but he did a lot more for African Americans than Woodrow Wilson did. And I just find it perplexing. And when you first learn that, I certainly didn't learn it in school. I didn't learn it in college. I've only learned it in the last 20 or so years, when we've become much more focused on racial divides and race relations in America. It almost exhausted my support for Woodrow Wilson. In other words, that's almost a deal breaker for me. And I know that's not good historiography, but it is exactly how I feel. He also installed, here's one of our 10 points, he installed a film theater in the White House. He was the first president to show films. He loved Hollywood. And one of the films he showed in 1915 was The Birth of a Nation, which is a piece of propaganda, an extraordinarily important piece of cinema, but a piece of propaganda for the KKK and the Lost Cause. And he praised it. He praised it publicly. So when you think, wow, today we can't even watch Birth of a Nation without cringe goggles. We watch it because it's an important piece in the history of cinema, but we don't ever watch it with anything other than disgust. And here's a sitting president of the United States not only airing this thing, but praising it.
Well, I think your discomfort with Wilson is shared by a lot of historians, and it is actually reflected in the C-SPAN presidential rankings over time. So one of the things that I think is so interesting about how these rankings are obviously complicated, although people should know behind the scenes, it's actually much more complex than just picking your favorites. You have to grade presidents on 10 different factors, and it's a whole thing. But over time, Wilson has really fallen in the rankings. So in 2021, the last time they did one of these, he was ranked 13th. In 2000, so 20 years before, he was ranked 6th. And I think that shift is largely because of things like increasingly including approaches to civil rights in these factors, approaches to gender, approaches to labor, and also civil rights of a different sort, which is sort of the domestic civil rights of voting rights and citizenship, which he also gets spectacularly poor grades on, which I think we will talk more about. But you're not alone in sort of rethinking these feelings about Wilson and feeling that he's kind of cringy if you look at all these different elements.
Thank you, Lindsay. We need to take a short break. Talking with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky about Woodrow Wilson, 10 things about the 28th President of the United States. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, 10 Things About Woodrow Wilson, with our 10 Things colleague, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay, what sort of a man was this? He's the son of a Presbyterian preacher. He's the grandson of a Presbyterian preacher. He rejected that as his own vocation, but there was a kind of a Presbyterian righteousness at the center of his character.
I agree entirely. He was deeply brilliant. He was very well educated. He was very well read. He got a PhD in political science and wrote a series of actually really monumental political science texts while he was a professor at various universities, including Bryn Mawr and then Princeton.
The first president who had a PhD, if that matters.
He was deeply ambitious. He was very interested in politics. He had strong ideas about what the presidency could and should be from sort of the start of his academic career, and then took them into politics. He also was a little bit of a loner. He didn't particularly like a lot of company, except he very much liked female company. He didn't have a lot of male friends, so we talk about some of these other presidents where they have, this crew of buddies that they hang out with. That was not Wilson.
Theodore Roosevelt, the tennis cabinet, a man's man having a man's cabinet.
Exactly. Eisenhower had his, golf buddies that he went to Augusta with, which were all millionaires, but Wilson didn't necessarily appreciate that type of company, but he did really like spending time with women and was very close with his first wife, Ellen, who died while he was in the White House, and then his second wife, Edith. And she was practically his chief of staff and prime minister and everything all rolled into one. And then we're going to talk more about her role later on. But I think that he was sort of probably a little bit shy, a little bit sensitive, found that the company of a woman was a little bit easier for him to bear.
As long as we're on this subject, let's get this on and off the table. So he's married twice. His first wife, Ellen, dies in 1914, just after the beginning of the Great War. So this must have been an extraordinarily difficult period for Woodrow Wilson to realize he's going to have to steer this country by way of neutrality, if possible, through a conflagration unprecedented in the history of human warfare. And his wife, whom he clearly greatly loved, dies right then, in a certain sense, at the worst possible moment. He soon remarries in 1915, and his second wife, Edith, eventually winds up being, in a sense, the president of the United States. There's also Mary Peck. He goes to Bermuda, sometimes with his first wife, sometimes alone. He meets a woman named Mary Peck. He falls in love with her. They exchange some really extraordinarily romantic letters. They may or may not have consummated the relationship. It does become an issue with his first wife, Ellen, and it's an issue as he's marrying his second wife, Edith. And you think, well, here's your Calvinist who's carrying on in a divisive way with a woman who's not his wife. As a historian, what do we make of this? I mean, we could ignore it and say this has nothing to do with his policies, 28th President of the United States, or we could say this is important and it has somehow to be factored into our evaluation of him. What do you make of this?
Well, I think I would make two things. While he was president, he was regularly distracted by personal matters. He was not very good at compartmentalizing. And in fact, after his first wife died, Ellen, he was so depressed and in such a state of depression that he really couldn't function and couldn't govern. And so his advisors were actually pretty quick to sort of like push him into the arms of Edith because it made him functional again as a human and he was excited and happy. And so he was not the type of president who could single-mindedly focus on his work issues. And so I think that is worth bearing into account, or at least as part of the presidential story, if you will. The second part, and I would say that this is a human condition, so I'm not saying this with pure judgment, but that he had a set of morals and virtues and values and often failed to live up to them. And I think we can see that in his treatment of race. We can see that in his approach to domestic civil rights. And we can see that in his approach to his wives. And so take that for what it's worth, because I think we all sometimes fail to live up to our own morals and values, hopefully on a less grand scale. But he was not different in any way than I think most humans and showed a real flaw.
If ever a president really needed a strong woman at his side, that person was Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, I think so, or at least someone to buck up his spirits. He was prone to some darkness and prone to depression, and so having someone who could provide some release from that and a distraction was really essential.
He's the last president to write most of his own speeches, which I find sort of interesting. Again, that goes from that pride. You know, he wanted to keep control of the messaging to a very large extent. He's the president who reinstated the State of the Union message. You know, it was something done before Congress by George Washington and by John Adams, but Jefferson, in his usual Jeffersonian way, rejected that and sent up his annual messages by courier. And Wilson decided that he would go up and address Congress. In fact, he addressed Congress 5 times in his first year as president, and he often sat in on congressional committee meetings, which would be unthinkable today. This is interesting to you, I think, because Washington thought, yeah, you go address the Congress. That makes perfect sense. What shocks me is that Theodore Roosevelt didn't reinvent this, because if anyone would have loved being in front of Congress and would have done a magnificent job, would have worked them like Bill Clinton plus Ronald Reagan plus Donald Trump, it would have been Theodore Roosevelt. But he didn't. He didn't think of it. And it must have killed him when he realized that this guy, he hated Wilson. And it must have killed him when he thought, I should have done that. Why? He shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, well, what I think is so interesting about that particular example that you gave is when Wilson was writing his dissertation, he argued that the congressional presidential system was broken and that it really made more sense to have a sort of prime minister parliamentary relationship where the president could work with Congress. And so he wasn't all that interested in a separation of powers between the different branches. And he came around to seeing how the president could be functional and effective and acknowledge that Theodore Roosevelt was the one that sort of had changed his mind about that process. And then when he was going to use it for all that it was worth. So it's funny that you mentioned that, he wanted to sit in on these congressional hearings, which, Lord, why? They can be so boring.
Even at their best, even when they're responsible, they're tedious.
Even when they're really good, they still could drag on. But I think that it shows his thinking about wanting to be almost like a prime minister and a president in one. But you mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, and that's one of the things that you and I both have on our list. So perhaps you could discuss their contentious and not particularly lovely relationship.
When they weren't in each other's way politically, they got along pretty well. Roosevelt and Wilson corresponded. Wilson came to Sagamore. They were pals in a certain way. They were both intellectuals. But when Wilson became the president in 1912, and it was clear that World War I was coming, it drove Theodore Roosevelt berserk. And I use the term carefully. A, he wanted to be the president because he was president for 7 years and 121 days, and there were no fundamental crisis. So he thought, hey, I'm the kind of guy you want in a fundamental crisis. He looked down on Wilson. He undermined Wilson's masculinity, called him names. He called him a Byzantine logothete, whatever that means. He sneered that Wilson's only foreign trip up until the time he was president had been on a bicycle tour of Scotland. And you can just imagine the snarkiness with which Roosevelt, I climbed the Matterhorn on my honeymoon. I punch out drunks in bars in the American West. I hunt lions. And Wilson, well, he went on a bicycle tour of Scotland. And
I wish that listeners could see your face while you're describing this. The hand gestures are just...
But you can imagine how this would kill Roosevelt. And here's what Roosevelt thought, and I want to get your opinion on this. Neither one of us is a World War I historian, we will freely admit. But Roosevelt felt, A, we're going to get in the war. There is no way the United States is going to be able to avoid this war because we have shipping in the Atlantic, and so we're in. B, we better be prepared for it because it is coming. If we get in early enough, we can help to control the post-war settlement, just as you mentioned about after World War II. So his view was, it's insane to talk about peace and to send these diplomatic notes of protest and to say there's something about being too proud to fight and so on. We are going to be drawn into this thing, and the more we wait, the worse it gets, and the more millions of people who have to die. And, I actually think, Lindsay, Roosevelt was right.
A lot of Americans really didn't want anything to do with it. It was still a pretty isolationist nation. We always have a strand of isolationism, but it was much larger back then. There wasn't necessarily a clear-cut argument of why we would get in, other than, of course, the shipping. And once that clear-cut argument, once the ships were indeed attacked and Americans were killed in significant numbers, then you see the public sentiment shift. The war had settled into a stalemate for years before the United States got into it. And once the United States did get into it and brought in fresh manpower and fresh supplies, it shifted the outcome of the war. And it would have, I think, saved a lot of lives and reduced the impact on the world because the war was so damaging to the French countryside in particular if we had gotten in earlier. Now, I do want to say Roosevelt's vision of war and what the reality of fighting in World War I meant were quite different.
Yeah, well, if he were here, you would be taking a little bit of rebuke because, first of all, he said that if you are going to be a president or a national leader and a war comes in your time, you get yourself into it. And he did in Cuba, and he was heroic in his own kind of Rooseveltian way. In the build-up to the war, he was writing for the Outlook, and he wrote savage attacks on Wilson. He called him Miss Nancy. He did everything he could to damage Wilson's standing with the American people. And then after this, like literally dozens of excoriatingly mean-spirited columns that Roosevelt wrote about Wilson's handling of the build-up to the war. Once the war was declared, Roosevelt went to see him in the White House and said, "Oh, that's all just like dust on a windy street. Forget what I've said. Now I want you to appoint me, create another group of Rough Riders, and we're going to go over there." And so he thought that Wilson was going to let him be a Rough Rider one more time. And I think Roosevelt felt that he might even die in France, and that was going to be a good thing, dying valiantly in battle. And Wilson said to him, Theodore, war has changed. It's now industrial. The guy on horseback with a bunch of volunteers from the Dakotas and Arizona is not going to be any help. It's going to, in fact, get in the way. I wish I'd love to be able to indulge you here. I just can't do it. War is not what it was when you went to Cuba in 1898. And Roosevelt was so offended and hurt by this.
Well, because what Wilson was basically saying is you're old.
This is not the light brigade in the Crimea. This is machine guns and artillery. But what's so interesting for me about this, Lindsay, is that Roosevelt wanted Wilson to agree that bygones are bygones. I can savage you for years in the public press, but now that I need a favor, let's just put all that behind us. And so he thought that Wilson did it just to be mean to TR. I don't think that's true at all. I don't think TR was high on Wilson's thinking at this time as he's preparing the country to go to war.
Well, I think that Wilson had very good reason for saying no. I think that Roosevelt would have probably been a distraction. He certainly would have not understood how war was fought at that point. I think that Wilson was also concerned that Roosevelt would soak up all the limelight in a way that only Roosevelt could do and didn't want that to happen. And so I do think there was a personal element to it, but it doesn't mean that he was wrong. It was probably the right choice, but I think there were also probably personal reasons.
But don't you think it would have been kind of interesting if Roosevelt and chubby old Roosevelt had gone off on a horse and gotten himself killed? And it would be like the ultimate final act of Roosevelt's extraordinary life. As you know, when Elvis died, they said, great career move.
I think that, yes, it would have been a great career move. And I think that it would have been an ending he would have preferred.
So here's one that I find really interesting. The election of 1912, about which I know a fair amount. Wilson wins. Roosevelt takes second with 27%, the largest third-party vote in American history. Nearly assassinated in Milwaukee. He gives the 84-minute speech. All this Rooseveltian bravado and heroics. But here's what struck me as I was preparing for this, Lindsay. It took 46 ballots in the Democratic Convention before he was even nominated. That had to be an interesting political circus. 46 ballots. And then when he won by a relatively small margin, only 42% of the American popular vote. We think of Wilson as a much stronger political presence than, in fact, he was, at least in the beginning.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I think it's one of the smallest popular vote victories in American history, although one of the larger electoral college victories, which I think is one of the challenges of, of course, a third-party candidate. And you're right, we think of him as a super powerful president, and frankly, there's good reason, because in his first term, especially before the war had really taken on a life of its own, he passed a really incredible amount of legislation that still continues to be with us today. So what we think of today, the Federal Reserve, the Federal Banking Commission.
Thus depoliticizing the nature of central national banking and creating the workman's compensation, 8-hour workday for railroad workers, child labor laws. He actually took on the progressive agenda that Roosevelt was also a part of in 1912 and got it through Congress in that first term, one of the great first terms ever.
Protections for farmers, tariff reform. I mean, it's really pretty remarkable the amount that he accomplished with such a small electoral victory. And again, that goes back to his ability. He worked really closely with leaders in Congress to try and make sure that these things were amenable and popular before they got passed. So he showed a remarkable ability to politic when he put his mind to it.
Wilson came in after a very, very limited time as a public officer.
He did, although he used that 2 years as governor to great effect, as you mentioned. He kind of test run a lot of these provisions or a lot of this legislation at the New Jersey level, got it passed, and then brought it to the national level.
In the second term, he had a stroke, a series of strokes, but a major stroke until he was essentially incapacitated. He had to learn to speak again, and he couldn't control his body, and he was impaired to the point that today the 25th Amendment would almost certainly be invoked because he couldn't perform his duties as the president of the United States. This was covered up to a very large extent, and his wife Edith stepped in a big way and, in a sense, took charge of his presidency. How dangerous is it to have a president who's that deeply impaired and the country is being operated by a spouse who was never elected to that office?
I mean, I personally think it's horrific. I think that it is among one of the larger scandals in American history that tends to sort of be glossed over, because I don't think that Edith had malicious intent. I think she was worried that if he didn't have the presidency to try and come back to, he would die, and she loved him deeply and was trying to do what was best for him and was trying to follow the doctor's advice, which is that he needed to rest and not have any sort of disruption and not have too many responsibilities and not have that much. And we know now today, actually, with stroke rehabilitation, that rest is important, but it's also really important to have engagement and to have things that you participate in and can look forward to. So on one hand, she was right to sort of try and preserve this for him, but actually probably should have been out and about more in a more active way. It was a complete destruction of the constitutional order of power, because our system gives the presidency so much authority. People couldn't get to the president, and when they did have a meeting, it was highly staged and highly choreographed so that it made it look like he was better than he was. The fact that she was deciding what materials he saw, what letters he read, who he spoke to, what decisions he made. And then she would often say that she had, talked to him and she was reporting his decision. But we don't know that, especially at the beginning, if he was even able to speak. So how was he communicating those decisions? So, I mean, really, it was kind of a coup. And we don't want to talk about that because I think that it's uncomfortable, but you're right. This is exactly why we have the 25th Amendment, and this should not be confused with someone who has had a bad day or someone who's tired. This is, a president who could not speak, could not walk, could not talk, could not sign letters, could not issue orders, and that is not acceptable.
So it would be interesting if we had another X-ray machine that could show us each of the presidents who was effectively impaired or not able to perform his duties up to the standards that we think of when we think of the president. I think of Ronald Reagan in his second term when Alzheimer's had already begun to take over his life, and that was carefully controlled, and that comes after the 25th Amendment. I'll leave out Donald Trump because that's not really about impairment of the kinds that we're talking about here. We need to take another break. We're talking with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, our favorite correspondent from the East Coast, particularly on questions of 10 things, this time 10 things about the 28th President of the United States, Mr. Woodrow Wilson. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and across from me, at least virtually, is Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay, World War I, like all of the great wars in American history, has put a strain on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And another thing that I find really disappointing in Woodrow Wilson is the extent to which he and the Congress of the United States demonized dissent is essential to a republic, to a democracy. The First Amendment is a very clear and unambiguous sort of statement. And yet the Red Scare that came during this period had some authoritarian feeling towards it, and it doesn't sit well with lovers of human rights and the Bill of Rights. Talk a little bit about why that happened and can it be justified?
Yeah, that's a great setup, and I think that this is one of the real challenges between war and our republic. They put conflicting tensions on the nation and the nation's leaders, and in every moment of crisis, starting in the 1790s, there has been legislation passed, Congress has passed legislation that limits in some ways the rights or abilities of people who are present or citizens. And so I say it in that way because in 1798, the very first Alien Enemy Act was passed when the United States was in the middle of a quasi-war with France that allowed the president to deport people of French descent that were deemed dangerous. And that law is actually still on the books today. Congress at that time also passed sedition acts, and these acts and various sedition acts were re-upped during World War I, as well as an espionage act. These bills allowed federal individuals to round up, to investigate, to detain, and to deport individuals that were considered dangerous or of enemy status. So German Americans, but also anyone that was deemed radical, anyone that was suspected of having radical ties to socialism or communism or even just being an anarchist was deemed extremely dangerous. The federal government implemented a series of measures that allowed the federal government to look at citizens' private mail, allowed them to censor and restrict major publications. So, I mean, these are not sort of like you're finding a genuinely dangerous person and restricting them. These are restricting the very basic rights of American citizens.
Yeah, so let me give you a couple of examples. Eugene Debs gave a speech in 1918 in Canton, Ohio, for which he was sentenced to 10 years. 10 years in prison for saying things like, it's not clear that the war is just, it's not clear that this is our war, the munitions industry is a cheerleader in wars like this. 10 years. Out here in North Dakota, Kate Richards O'Hare, I don't know if you know that name, she was a dissident. She gave a speech in Bowman, North Dakota during this period in which she said, Why should American women be brood sows for young men who are going to be killed in this war? And this was offensive for a number of different reasons. But she was tried and spent 5 years in prison, where she became a prison activist, which is wonderful to think about. A.C. Townley, the founder of the Nonpartisan League, which was the greatest agrarian protest movement of the 20th century, gave a speech saying that we should send some plutocrats to the war because their big fatness would take more bullets than our lean farm boys. He went to prison in Jackson, Minnesota. So, I mean, these are things that I regard as essentially harmless, maybe irresponsible, but essentially harmless, and certainly within the idea of the First Amendment. I mean, if the First Amendment means anything, it has to protect dissident speech and obnoxious speech and offensive speech. If it only protects rotary, then it's not worth having. So disappointing. And this isn't the last time, of course. When we go to war, as you say, this paradox sets in that security suddenly begins to edge out liberty, and the courts have had a really highly imperfect record in protecting First Amendment rights in times of national crisis.
Absolutely. And the problem is that the genuine argument for security, which I do believe that there is one, there is I think, a good faith argument that federal authority should increase in times of war, can often be used to cover up other political aims or other more nefarious sentiments.
How should a historian think about this? Jefferson famously said, the rights of humanity are extremely important, but they are subordinate to the survival of a nation. The survival of a nation, if its very survival is at stake, the government of the United States may need to do some things that it doesn't really want to do and which aren't strictly speaking kosher, but it does because survival is more important than anything else. And as you know, that argument is invoked again and again and again. And when you're in the midst of the quasi-war, you think Adams talked himself into believing that Napoleon might send 60,000 troops to New Jersey. And during World War I, there was a sense that there were, especially because we had a heavy German immigration population, particularly in the heartland, that this may turn out to be dangerous. So that in each of these instances, there is a case to be made that security at this moment is the only important thing. Yes, we regret that we have to jail some dissidents and to confiscate some pamphlets. The alternative of perhaps losing the country itself justifies this extra-constitutional behavior. And of course, that has to be true, right? That can be so easily misused.
It's challenging because, of course, we have the benefit of hindsight, and so we know how things worked out, and we know what was a real and what was a perceived threat. And so it is hard to Monday morning quarterback this type of decision. And as you've discussed, no right is absolute, especially none of the amendments are without limitation. So even the First Amendment, which has been so important to our nation's history and generally protected-ish by the court, it has limitations as well. You're not, the famous one is you're not allowed to, shout fire in a crowded theater if there is no fire. So there is a place for government restriction. And I think there is a good faith argument and the government can make it that it needs to take on additional authorities when there is a real threat.
Well, that's my view, too. And I'm sorry that the writers of the Constitution didn't try to figure out some sort of language that would enable and yet restrain this, maybe that such a law had to be immediately fast-tracked to the Supreme Court or, something along those lines, but they didn't. You mentioned Germany's approach to Mexico, as an aside, the Zimmermann Telegraph. Germany made every wrong move, and it was for the return to unrestricted submarine warfare that finally took even Woodrow Wilson over the edge, and then he asked for a declaration of war from Congress, that American nationals were now being persecuted and killed when they were mostly innocent. But even with, say, the Lusitania, that ship was a British passenger ship. We now know it was carrying contraband, and that the Germans, in a sense, were right that a ship carrying contraband is fair game. If you don't want to be attacked, then make sure you don't carry illegal goods during a time of war. Wilson wasn't sure after the Lusitania what he should do. And Roosevelt, again, went berserk over this. And what Roosevelt said, because there had been ads in American papers saying the Lusitania was sailing on such and such a day. Roosevelt, you know what I would have done? I would have taken the entire... Get them all on that boat. Now sail to London and see if the Germans want to take that down. That makes kind of a sense. It's a typical broadside from a person out of power who's really annoyed that he's no longer in power. Wilson, this towering idealist, honestly believed that if we found the right arbitration mechanism, we might be able to prevent future wars. The League of Nations failed, in large part because the U.S. refused to join it. The United Nations has not succeeded in every aspect, and many Americans regard it as a failure. I don't. But it hasn't been able to prevent wars. I think what Theodore Roosevelt and Alexander Hamilton and Machiavelli and St. Augustine and Calvin would say is, it's a dangerous world out there. You're never going to prevent wars. You've got to be willing to step up, righteously if possible, to protect your national interests. And the idea that there will be a final arbiter that can prevent a war like the Great War or World War II is really just fairy tale stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I fall somewhere in the middle. I would like to think that through increased engagement, there are conflicts that can be reduced, prevented, or perhaps solved more quickly, which I do think that UN involvement has helped reduce the length of particular conflicts, sometimes once they've broken out, or once there is a resolution, help preserve that peace resolution, or that, what's the word I'm looking for? Armistice for a period of time. So I think that there is use, there is value. I think that having increased communication is never a bad thing. And I understand the argument of why people thought that would help after World War I, because that war it's not like you had this evil empire that was set for global domination, like the Nazi Empire was. It was a series of sort of small triggers and long festering misunderstandings and empires that had traded borders and, really just centuries of stuff that had built up. And so, in theory, if you had a space where negotiation and compromise and conversation could take place, perhaps it could have been prevented. I get that argument. I'm not willing to totally discount it. And yet, to your point, there are things like ethnic conflict and evilness and, domination that we simply cannot prevent. And what we're currently living through, the largest land war since World War II in Europe, is a good example of how the UN cannot necessarily prevent war, at least under its current direction and power and parameters.
Funny you should say that, because I was about to say something similar, that, here's Ukraine, a war that really harkens back to 1942, and you almost want to see it in black and white. This brutal, brutal artillery war, total war, ruthlessness, civilian damage, torture. Not that some of this doesn't happen in most wars, but really Putin's approach to it is brutality. We're going to brutalize Ukraine into submission. And, if Ukraine were a member of NATO, then Article 5 would have required NATO to step in to protect it. It's not, and so we're in this kind of strange sort of limbo. But here's what's so interesting. I haven't heard word one from the United Nations. Of course, they're talking about it, working on it, but it's not part of the news cycle. They're not doing anything particular. They're standing by and wringing their hands, and, because Russia's on the Security Council, that closes off one possibility of this. But the UN is essentially impotent in the face of something like this. And so there's a dream that didn't come to pass. And I believe the United States actually I think the U.S. bears a very large responsibility for the failure of the UN over history. But it makes you wish that something like that could work. And of course, as you say, it has done mighty and important things in the world, the UN. But in the end, when a nation like Russia decides to erase Ukraine, a resolution in the UN Security Council or the General Assembly is not going to make any particular difference. If Vladimir Putin were responsive to world public opinion, he wouldn't be in this war, right?
There's no resolution that the UN could have passed that would have stopped Putin. I think the only thing that would have stopped Putin is Ukraine being in NATO, because if Ukraine was in NATO, then Article 5 would have been invoked. And it's clear that Putin doesn't want to fully engage NATO because he hasn't stepped a toe over NATO lines. And so, not yet.
In fact, we've done that. By sending materiel in the ways that we have to Ukraine, the argument can be made that we have been behaving in quite a provocative manner in a proxy war there, and that from Putin's point of view, if you just take Putin's point of view for a moment, NATO and the West are meddling in what he regards as a greater Russian internal problem.
I have no doubt that he thinks that. I refuse to give any credence to that perspective, because He had to sign agreements agreeing to Ukraine's sovereignty. It's why Ukraine gave up the nuclear materials that were on its territorial possessions at the end of the Cold War. And he has just completely tried to destroy the nation. And so, yes, we have absolutely sent materials. We have not sent men, and we have not authorized the use of those materials attacking Russia. They have been primarily used for defensive purposes. Whether that will remain that way, I don't know. But to your point, to our original conversation, I don't think the UN will really have anything to do with it one way or the other.
Sad, very sad. And the League of Nations was even less effective. As we close, we just got a couple of minutes left. Wilson said before he became president, and I'm now quoting, "It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs." Well, it wasn't just foreign affairs. He had an enormous domestic record and a good one. But foreign affairs overtook his presidency. And I do think that Theodore Roosevelt would have been a better president during this crisis than Woodrow Wilson. I think if you're an ideologue for peace in a dangerous world, you're willing to bend over backwards to accommodate the possibilities of peace in ways that don't always work out in the brutality of realpolitik. And I think Roosevelt would have been splendid, but he wasn't in power. Wilson was. I think the major effect, and I want your opinion on this, the major effect of this was that he got so tied up in foreign affairs that he stopped nurturing Congress. And so when he needed Congress at the other end of the war, he hadn't done the hard work to keep them aboard his vision.
I think that's absolutely right. And it goes back to your comment about his ego and sort of his messiah complex, because he felt that he needed to do so much of that diplomacy and the war effort and building the allies with the European powers himself. He often didn't trust a Secretary of State or some other advisor to do it on his behalf. And so he was gone a lot, and he felt he did not give Congress the attention that it needed or that it felt it deserved. And I think the point about it would, the irony of his presidency being about foreign affairs really goes to show that when we elect presidents, we don't know what is coming down the road. So the same could be said for George W. Bush. He ran on an economic platform, and 6 months into his presidency, well, a little more than 6 months into his presidency, 9/11 happened, and it completely changed the entire direction of his administration. He's not the first, he is not going to be the last. And so I think it behooves us to think about not so much a president's position on one issue or position on one piece of legislation, but I think this is why character really matters, and experience matters, and, intelligence and personal ability, because we cannot predict what comes down the road. The only thing we can do is try and ensure we have someone who would handle a crisis the way we would.
Couldn't agree more. We're out of time, but, what you want is what Mrs. Clinton said in the 2016 campaign. Who do you want to be answering the phone when the crisis comes? Who do you want to be picking up that phone? Didn't work for her, but it's the right question that she's asking. Who do you want to be on the watch when the World Trade Center comes down, when there's a massive earthquake, when there are race riots throughout the United States, when there's a foreign war, an attack on a neutral country, when the world's economy collapses? Who do you want to be picking up that phone? They might be trained for domestic. They might be trained for foreign. You don't know what they're going to be facing, but you want to make sure that that person has the right stuff. And the right stuff are many of the qualities that Woodrow Wilson had. So as we close, tell us a book we should read on the 28th president of the United States or his spouse, Edith.
So there's a book called Ellen and Edith, Woodrow Wilson's First Ladies by Christine Miller, which I think is interesting. It really digs into their relationship with Woodrow, the difference in their personalities, and then, of course, their impact on the presidency. I'm kind of cheating because it's not really about Wilson, but The Wars of the Roosevelts by William Mann, I think, is really fascinating. It goes from Theodore Roosevelt to FDR, and of course includes Wilson there in the middle. And so I think that the concept of Roosevelt and war and Wilson and war is very much a part of that. And then if you really must read something on Wilson, anything by Thomas Knock. He's probably one of the best Wilson scholars, although he thinks much more highly of Wilson than I do, but is at least very thorough and rigorous. Thomas Knock is a phenomenal Wilson scholar.
We'll post those on our website. Let me add to that John Milton Cooper's book, The Warrior and the Priest, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, which turns out that the irony of that is that the warrior turns out to be Wilson and the priest turns out to be Roosevelt, which is one of the great, weird, topsy-turvy natures of American history.
History has a sense of humor.
We're talking with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, another really interesting episode on 10 things, this one on the 28th President Woodrow Wilson. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.